Welcome to Sports Love Media on YouTube. It's you guys, Sports Love, with Inside the Diamond for March 26th, 2026. All games that we talk about today in college baseball picks or college softball picks will be taking place tomorrow, March 27th, 2026. And today we're going to do things a little different. We're going to do the over some other sports news after I get through making my picks for that. And we're also going to do things a little different today. Normally, I deal with just all Division One sports. For college baseball, I'm going to be dealing with Division Two, and I'm going to make my picks for Division Two games. And then for softball, it'll be Division One. And I haven't made my picks yet, so I'm just going to go over each of the games that are going to be played, and then I'll make my picks on a page by page basis. Can y'all hear me out there in YouTube land? Anyway, in college baseball Division Two for games that will be tomorrow, March 27th, 2026, you have Purdue Northwest versus Grand Valley State, Slippery Rock versus Pitt Johnstown, West Chester versus East Stroudsburg, Maine or I'm sorry, Malone versus Northwood, and then Purdue Northwest versus Grand Valley State. We have Findlay versus Cedarville, California and Pennsylvania versus Lock Haven, Walsh versus Lake Erie, Indiana and Pennsylvania versus Seton or Seton Hall. We have Clarion versus Gannon, Vanguard versus Menlo, Kutztown versus Mansfield, Ashland versus Thomas More, Anderson, South Carolina versus Mars Hill, Missouri Southern State versus Arkansas Fort Smith. We have Newberry versus Carson Newman, Tuskegee versus Edward Waters, Erskine versus Chowan, Roosevelt versus McKendree, and Malloy versus Queens of New York. I have Queens of New York defeating Malloy. I have McKendree defeating Roosevelt, Tuskegee defeating Edward Waters, Erskine defeating Chowan, Newberry will defeat Carson Newman, Missouri Southern State will defeat Arkansas Fort Smith, Thomas More will defeat Ashland, Anderson, South Carolina will defeat Mars Hill, Vanguard will defeat Menlo, Kutztown will defeat Mansfield, Indiana and Pennsylvania will defeat Seton or Seton Hall. We have Clarion versus Gannon, and I have Clarion winning that one. Walsh versus Walsh. I have Bloomsburg beating Shippensburg. Findlay defeating Cedarville. California and Pennsylvania defeating Lock Haven. I have Grand Valley State beating Purdue Northwest. Malone defeating Northwood. West Chester defeating East Stroudsburg. Slippery Rock beating Pitt in Johnstown. And hello, I love my fans. How are you doing today? I'm glad that you joined me today. We are going through Inside the Diamond, college baseball and college softball picks. We're doing things a little different today. Today, picks for college baseball, and it's Division One for softball for making picks today. So that's what we're doing right now. I'm going page by page on the games and then making my picks accordingly because I didn't pre-make my picks like I normally do. In this next set of games, we have Southwest Baptist versus Missouri St. Louis, North Greenville versus Ferrum, Truman State versus Lewis, Northwest Nazarene versus Central Washington, Texas Dallas versus Texas A&M International, Mercy versus DUville, Southwest Oklahoma versus East Central, Oklahoma Baptist versus Southeastern Oklahoma, Cal State East Bay versus Cal State Monterey Bay, Lynn versus Rollins, William Jewell versus Maryville in Missouri, Harding versus Arkansas Monticello, CUI versus Point Lorma, sorry. And then, yeah, so we have that. And we have, it looks like Emporia State versus Rogers State. We have Upper Iowa versus Lindy. And I'm going to have Lindy defeat Upper Iowa. And Rogers State to defeat Emporia State. We have Quincy versus Illinois Springfield, Virginia State versus Apprentice, Wisconsin Parkside versus Saginaw Valley, St. Thomas Aquinas versus Staten Island, Slippery Rock versus Pitt Johnstown, Westchester versus East Stroudsburg, California and Pennsylvania versus Lock Haven, Bloomberg versus Shippensburg. Oh wait, I've already gone over these. Okay, here's the other side. Southwest Baptist versus Missouri St. Louis, North Greenville versus Fair. Yeah, okay. So I'm going to go over these picks real quick. I have Tusculum beating Lincoln Memorial. I have Valdosta State beating Mississippi College. UAH will defeat Delta State. Mansfield will defeat Kutztown. Seton Hall will defeat Indiana, Pennsylvania. Clarion will defeat Gannon. Bloomsburg will beat Shippensburg. California and Pennsylvania will defeat Lock Haven. Westchester will defeat Easttown will defeat Slippery Rock. Wisconsin Parkside will defeat Saginaw Valley. St. Thomas Aquinas will defeat Staten Island. Virginia State will defeat Apprentice. Quincy will defeat Illinois Springfield. I have Harding defeating Arkansas Monticello. CUI defeating Point Lorna. William Jewell defeating Maryville, Missouri. Lynn defeating Rollins. Oklahoma Baptist will defeat Southeastern Oklahoma. Cal State East Bay will defeat Cal State Monterey Bay. Davenport will defeat Wayne State in Michigan. East Central will defeat Southwestern Oklahoma. The Uville International. Truman State will defeat Lewis. Northwest Nazarene will defeat Central Washington. Ferrum will defeat North Greenville. And Missouri St. Louis will defeat Southwest Baptist. All right, the next set of games that we're going to look at, we have Pittsburgh State versus Northwest Missouri State. We have Ohio Dominican versus Hillsdale. Malone versus Northwood. Rockhurst versus Missouri S&T. Bentley versus Pace. Colorado Christian versus CSU Pueblo. Walsh versus Lake Erie. Trevecca Nazarene versus Christian Brothers. Findlay versus Cedarville. Jessup versus Azusa. Findlay versus Cedarville. Southern Wesleyan versus Emmanuel in Georgia. Northeastern State versus Washburn. Middle Georgia versus Flagler. Vanguard versus Menlo. UT Permian Basin versus UT Tyler. St. Leo versus Florida Tech. We have NM Highlands versus UCCS. Clark Atlanta versus Albany State in Georgia. Adams State versus MSU Denver. Drury versus Lincoln, Missouri. Versus Lane. Barton versus Belmont Abbey. Eastern New Mexico versus Oklahoma Christian. Stanislaus State versus Cal State San Marcos. Eckerd versus Berry. Tampa versus Embry-Riddle in Florida. Georgia Southwestern versus Lander. Lee versus Montevallo. And Claflin versus USC Aiken. So in those games, I have Claflin beating USC Aiken. Montevallo defeating Lee. Lander defeating George Western. Embry-Riddle will defeat Cal State San Marcos. Eastern Mexico will defeat Oklahoma Christian. Belmont Abbey will defeat Barton. Tuskegee will defeat Edward Waters. Spring Hill will defeat Lane. Drury will defeat Lincoln in Missouri. Adams State will defeat MSU in Denver. NM Highlands will defeat UCCS. Clark Atlanta will defeat Albany State in Georgia. Pittsburgh State will defeat Northwest Missouri State. Hillsdale will defeat Malone will defeat Missouri S&T. Bentley will defeat Pace. Colorado Christian Pueblo. Walsh will defeat Lake Erie. Trevecca Nazarene will defeat Christian Brothers. Jessup will defeat Azusa Pacific. Cedarville will defeat Findlay. Emmanuel in Georgia will lose to Southern Wesleyan. Washburn will win over Northeastern State. Flagler will lose to Middle Georgia. Menlo will lose to Vanguard. UT Birmingham Basin will lose to UT Tyler. And St. Leo will defeat Florida Tech. set of Division II baseball games. We have Mount Olive versus Francis Marion, Catawba versus Coker, West Florida versus AUM, Northwest Nazarene versus Washington, North Georgia versus Augusta, USC Beaufort versus Columbus State. We have Emory and Henry versus Wingate, King and Tennessee versus Young Harris, Nova Southeastern versus Palm Beach, Atlanta, CUI versus Port Lorna, Point Lorma, something like that. Shorter versus UNC Pembroke, Cameron versus SUL Ross State. And then we have Southern Nazarene versus Northwestern Oklahoma. We have Ouachita Baptist versus Arkansas Tech, West Texas A&M versus St. Mary's in Texas, West Alabama versus Union in Tennessee, St. Edwards versus Lubbock Christian, Texas A&M and Kingsville versus Angelo State, Jessup versus Azusa Pacific, Colorado School of Mines versus Colorado Mesa, CSU Valley, Chico State versus Cal State Louisiana, Cal State Dorn Hills versus Cal Poly Pomona, Fresno Pacific versus Chaminade, Newman versus Missouri Western, Fort Hays State versus Central Oklahoma, Lenore Rhine versus UVA Wise. So in those games, Lenore beating UVA Wise. Fort Hays State will defeat Central Oklahoma. Chaminade will defeat Fresno Pacific. Cal Poly Pomona will defeat Cal State Dom Hills. Cal State LA will defeat Chico State. Utah Valley will beat CSUSB. Azusa Pacific will defeat Jessup. Colorado Mesa will defeat Colorado School of Mines. Excuse me. Angelo State will defeat Texas A&M in Kingsville. Lubbock Christian will lose to St. Edwards. Arkansas Tech will win over Ouachita Baptist. Northwestern Oklahoma will defeat Southern Nazarene. Virginia State will defeat Apprentice. Henderson State will defeat Southern Arkansas. Cameron will defeat SUL Ross State. UNC Pembroke will defeat Shorter. Nova Southeastern will defeat Palm Beach, Atlanta. CUI will defeat Point Lorma. King, Tennessee will defeat Young Harris. Emory and Henry will defeat Wingate. USC Beaufort will defeat Columbus State. North Georgia will defeat Northwest Nazarene will defeat Central Washington. West Florida will lose to AUM. Mount Olive will defeat Francis Marion. Catawba will defeat Coker. So that is all of the college baseball Division II games that will be taking place tomorrow, March 27th, 2026. Now, I'm going to go over the NCAA Division I softball games, college softball games, and we'll do a page-by-page situation like I did with the other. I'll go over who is playing, and then I'll make my picks on who I think will win. I didn't make my pre-picks already, so we'll just go through the softball. And the games will take place tomorrow, March 27th, 2026. You have Illinois State versus UNI, Georgia Southern versus Coastal Carolina, Indiana State versus Valparaiso, IU Indy versus Green Bay. We have Butler versus St. John's in New York, Hampton versus North Carolina A&T, Towson versus Stony Brook, Arkansas Pine Bluff versus Grambling, Providence versus Seton Hall, Marist versus North Carolina, NC State University, Kent State versus Miami in Ohio, Buffalo versus Bowling Green, Akron versus Western Michigan, DePaul versus UConn, Arizona State versus Marist, Belmont versus Southern Illinois. In those games, I have Belmont defeating Southern Illinois. I have Arizona State defeating Marist. Akron will defeat Western Michigan. UConn will defeat DePaul. Bowling Green will defeat Buffalo. Ohio University will win over Central Michigan. Nichols will defeat Lamar University. Toledo will lose to Ball State. Syracuse will lose to North Carolina State. Seton Hall will lose to Providence. North Carolina will lose to Marist. Towson will defeat Stony Brook. Arkansas Pine Bluff will defeat Grambling. Hampton will defeat North Carolina A&T. Butler will defeat St. John's of New York. Illinois State will defeat UNI. Indiana State will defeat Valparaiso. Georgia Southern loses to Coastal Carolina. All right, next set of games for college softball. We have Northern Kentucky versus Youngstown State, Robert Morris versus Oakland, Seattle University versus Creighton, Evansville versus Drake, Illinois State versus UNI, Indiana State versus Valparaiso, UIC versus Bradley, Georgetown versus Villanova, Southern Utah versus Utah Tech, Virginia Tech versus Boston College, Alabama State versus Alabama A&M, South Alabama versus James Madison, Georgia Southern versus Coastal Carolina, Presbyterian versus Radford, Sacramento State versus Northern Colorado, South Dakota versus St. Thomas in Minnesota, Texas Southern versus Prairie View, Campbell versus Elon, Alcorn versus Southern U, Nichols versus Lamar University, Purdue versus Michigan, North Dakota versus South Dakota State, Winthrop versus Charleston Southern, Arizona State versus North Carolina, East Texas A&M versus Northwestern State, Southeastern Louisiana versus Texas A&M Corpus Christi, Drexel versus Hofstra, UAB versus East Carolina, SFA versus Houston Christian. Okay, and in those picks, I have Youngstown State defeating Northern Kentucky, Oakland defeating Robert Morris, UNI will defeat Illinois State, Valparaiso will defeat Indiana State, Bradley defeats UIC, Georgetown will defeat Villanova, Southern Utah Tech, Virginia Tech will defeat Boston College, Alabama A&M will defeat Alabama State, South Alabama defeats James Madison, Coastal Carolina defeats Georgia Southern, Green Bay will defeat IU Indy. I have Radford defeating Presbyterian, Northern Colorado defeating Sacramento State, South Dakota will defeat St. Thomas in Minnesota, Prairie Elon, Alcorn will defeat Southern U, Nichols will defeat Lamar University, Purdue will defeat Michigan, North Dakota will win over South Dakota State, Charleston Southern will defeat Winthrop, North Carolina will win over Arizona State, East Texas A&M will defeat Northwestern State, Texas A&M Corpus Christi will win over Southeastern Louisiana, Hofstra will defeat Drexel, UAB will defeat East Carolina, SFA will defeat Houston Christian. All right, the next set of games that we have: Michigan State versus Ohio State, Massachusetts versus NIU, UTEP versus Kennesaw State, Kansas City versus Omaha, Jacksonville State versus FIU, Delaware versus Liberty, Tulsa versus Memphis, Tarleton State versus UT Arlington, Pacific versus St. Mary's in California, Maryland versus Wisconsin, Evansville versus Drake, Penn State versus Rutgers, Columbia of COL of Charleston versus UNCW, Florida State versus Clemson. Then it looks like Georgia State versus App State, Mississippi Valley versus Jackson State. I'm going to have Mississippi Valley beat Jackson State and Georgia State defeating App State. Then you have North Texas versus Charlotte, Boise State. You have California versus Notre Dame, Pittsburgh versus Virginia, UIC versus Bradley, Ole Miss versus Tennessee, Detroit Mercy versus Indiana, Georgia Tech versus Louisville, UTSA versus Florida Atlantic, Illinois versus Minnesota, Stanford versus Duke, Wichita State versus South Florida, Southern Utah versus Utah Tech, and Georgia versus Kentucky. In those games, I have Georgia beating Kentucky. I have Utah Tech defeating Southern Utah. I have I have Stanford defeating Duke. I have South Florida defeating UTSA to defeat Florida Atlantic. Indiana will defeat Detroit Mercy. Louisville to defeat Georgia Tech. Tennessee to defeat Ole Miss. Bradley will defeat UIC. California will defeat Notre Dame. Virginia will defeat Pittsburgh. Colorado State will win over Boise State. Charlotte will defeat North Texas. Let's see, I have UNCW defeating CO. Rutgers defeating Penn State. Drake defeating Evansville Charleston. I have Evansville Pacific defeating Tarleton State will defeat UT Arlington. Tulsa will defeat Memphis. Jacksonville State will lose to FIU. Liberty loses to Delaware. UTEP will defeat Kennesaw Omaha. Massachusetts will defeat NIU. Michigan State will defeat Ohio State. All right, next set of college softball games. And I'm going to go ahead and go over these. So this is, yeah. All right, so we have Santa Clara versus LMU in California, Baylor versus Arizona, Utah Valley versus California Baptist, UNLV versus Fresno State, San Diego versus Oregon State. On these games, I'm going to go Utah Valley over California Baptist, Arizona over Baylor, LMU State. I have one more page of college softball, and then we'll move to other sports. All right, we have Sacramento State versus Northern Colorado, Belmont versus Southern Illinois, UCLA versus Nebraska, Iowa State versus Texas Tech, Missouri versus Auburn, UCF versus Houston, Oregon versus Northwestern, Florida versus Arkansas, Oklahoma versus LSU, Missouri State versus Louisiana Tech, UIW versus McNeese, East Texas A&M versus North Dakota State versus Alabama, Louisiana versus ULM, Texas A&M versus Texas, Mississippi versus Troy, SFA versus Houston Christian, Middle Tennessee versus Sam Houston, Massachusetts versus NIU, Oklahoma State versus Utah, Austin Peay versus Central Arkansas, Grand Canyon versus Utah State, Washington versus Iowa, Utah Valley versus California Baptist, San Diego State versus New Mexico, Long Beach State versus UC Kentucky versus New Mexico State, San Jose State versus Nevada. Then we have, okay. So now we shall make picks on who I think will win those games. Thank you, Lyser Diaz, yeah, whatever that is. Lyser, thank you for joining me today. And I love my fans.